So yesterday we kind of got up to the point in the story of the Buddha's life of his attaining awakening, and then how he was requested by the very powerful gods of his time to teach, and that was what started to sway his mind to try and share his experience with others, because he doubted whether anybody in this world would, understand what he was talking about. And you can see why he felt that way, because the world is so worldly. Yeah, I mean, we are so entranced with sense objects, so so much seeking recognition and fame and glory and popularity and power, and the world just has its own aims, its own objects of importance, and spiritual life, as the Buddha lived it and as we aspire to live it, goes in the opposite direction. They talk of monastic life as swimming upstream, and also being a white crow. How many white crows do you see? Yeah. So you're doing something quite unusual, that is challenging all of our conditioning that we've received so far in this life. Yeah. So everything that our parents and family has taught us, our world, our society has taught us, some of it is good and valuable. We want to build up on that. We all learned ethical discipline and some ethical conduct from our family. We learned about kindness and things like this from our family. But then we also learned a lot of other things from our family and from society that are counter to what a spiritual path like Buddhism is taking us to. So we have to really look at all those things, and how not only how the external world has conditioned us, but how we have adopted the values and conditioning of the external world and made it our own. In other words, how much we've got hooked. Because we like to think, I don't have any attachment. I'm free of attachment. I'm free of anger. But when we look deeper and we see, what we're asked to do as monastics, we sometimes recoil at, what? I can't do this? What's wrong with doing that? And, or maybe it's not even the precepts in the Vinaya, it's the guidelines or rules of the particular monastery you're staying in. And the mind says, why do they have that rule? That's not fair. I don't like that. That's not in Vinaya. They should change that. In other words, where I live should cater to my ideas and preferences and opinions. Okay, but I don't have any attachment. Okay, so we're constantly up against this, and so it requires a good bit of looking honestly at ourselves and looking at the stories we tell ourselves, because I think we've got to question everything. If we're going to become fully awakened Buddhas, we have to put everything under the microscope and question it, and question it with analytical wisdom, not question it if it complies with my worldview and my opinions. Okay, which is what we usually do. Yeah, we usually use my worldview, my opinions, and evaluate everything else according to that. Here we're being asked to really apply wisdom and see if our worldview and our opinions are correct or not. And we find some rather surprising things in the process, yeah, that we don't always like to admit. But the thing is that when we're able to admit these things, then we're able to counteract them and do something. Yeah, as long as we are defending our ego territory, then it becomes very difficult to grow. Yeah, because our goal becomes to defend our ego territory. Yeah, not to really question and go deeper and shed some of these things. Okay, so our spiritual life, especially monastic life, is really like that, and it means dedicating your life to that, because there's a higher purpose, a higher goal that you're seeking. Yeah. And so, yes, it will be uncomfortable for our egos and our self-centeredness, most definitely. Most definitely. So we have to have some inner strength that is okay with that, and that even rejoices, when those things in us are challenged. Because, as I always say, if you're going to clean the room, you have to see the dirt. So if we can't see the dirt, we can't clean it. And so when those things are challenged in us, then, our own dirt becomes quite visible. Yeah. So instead of responding to that, again in our old habitual ways of, oh, somebody saw my dirt, somebody saw my fault, somebody saw my opinionatedness. Oh dear, what's going to happen to my reputation? My reputation is ruined. Those people are not going to like me. They don't think well of me. What is going to happen? This is terrible. I better leave. I'm just so ashamed. But I'm not ashamed. I'm angry. How dare they tell me what to do? Those bossy people who are so attached to their own opinions and ideas. Okay, so, this is how we usually respond, isn't it? Either, like, oh, they're beating up on me, it's unfair, or I'm going to attack back. Okay? And so, that's what people in the world do. And isn't that why we want to practice a spiritual path? Because we've looked at the world and we've seen that those two ways of reacting to things we don't like to hear, that they don't work. Isn't that why we came here? Because we realized, hey, I can blame all I want and say it's unfair all I want. I can get angry all I want. But is that going to, you look around and does it bring any happiness in the world? Does it bring any peace and tranquility in the world? And then we see, well, that's why I actually came to a spiritual path. So how come those same things are coming up here? I thought when I came to the monastery, I was done with all of that. The world is just so full of people being defensive and people being aggressive. And I came here to be free of all of that. And I'm sure that by the power of my renouncing that, I am now free of all of it. Yeah, and the community should be free of it, but they aren't. Yeah, I'm free of it, but they're full of partiality, hatred, ignorance, and fear. Yeah? Right? And this is exactly what happens. And then what we do is we play out our same old stuff. Yeah, the same old emotional patterns we had in lay life, we just import them right here into the monastery. Yeah, except now we think we're holy. And thank goodness for all of our Dharma friends who let us know that, sorry, you aren't holy. Sorry, those are your opinions. They're not the ultimate truth. Yeah. And then we have to kind of, begin to drop some of that stuff. And so we have to feel comfortable with having our stuff identified, and then with facing it ourselves. At first we don't like other people to identify our stuff. Yeah. They all know we have it, but they're not supposed to let on that they know. Yeah. They're supposed to buy into our self-image that now we are holy Buddhist practitioners. Yeah. They're not supposed to call me on my trips. But this is what our Dharma friends do, and this is what community does, is they call us on our trips. Yeah. And we don't like it. But isn't that why we came? Because we realize that at some level it's me, it's my mind, my afflictions that are the problem, not the rest of the world. So here's somebody pointing my afflictions out to me, and I'm trying to say, no, I don't have them, when the whole reason I came here was to identify them and free myself of these afflictions. Okay, so it's a rough and tumble sometimes. Okay, we have to be willing to be transparent. You're going to hear that word a lot around here, of being transparent. In other words, just to say, yeah, it's like that, because anyway, everybody knows our trips, and people know our afflictions. And so saying, hey, no, it's not like that. Nobody, are we really going to fool people? Yeah. Put it this way, when we're angry at somebody because somebody did something, okay? But we don't want to say we're angry, because that doesn't look very holy. And anyway, our teacher may point out that we're angry and we don't want to point it out. So we cover up our anger with, well, I'm really concerned about that other person. Yeah, that other person is doing these things that don't kind of fit with our lifestyle here, and I'm afraid that they have some problems. What shall we do to help them? Yeah. So we put it like that. That's not really what we're feeling. Sometimes we may actually be feeling like that. And in that case, it's quite good. Yes, we are concerned about each other. And we can see something coming up in someone when we want to help them. But what I'm saying here is we're actually angry, but we don't want to say we're angry either to ourselves or to the other person. So we put it out as if we're concerned with their well-being, when really our motivation is, how can we make them stop doing what they're doing because I don't like what they're doing? Are you getting what I'm saying? Yeah? So, so we pull that one a lot. Yeah. And it's, and people see that one too. Yeah, so we try so many ways to kind of make ourselves look good, and none of them seem to kind of work. At least they don't work consistently. Yeah. Sometimes we can fool people. What is it? You can fool some of the people some of the time, but not all of the people all of the time. Yeah, well, we still try and do that. Yeah, so this is why I think we need a sense of humor, because, this is the way self-grasping ignorance and self-centered mind work, and we need to be able to look at them and laugh at them because they're really pretty ridiculous. That's why we need a sense of humor, to be able to laugh at ourselves. okay? And not take ourselves so seriously. Because if we take ourselves too seriously, we just get so tied up. You know, oh, I have this fault, this horrible fault. And what's worse, everybody knows it. And what's even worse is they point it out. You know, it's like, we need to chill out a little bit. Yeah, okay, we have a fault, somebody sees us, they point it out. You know, this really isn't a national catastrophe. Yeah. Except there is one person nowadays whose faults can be a national catastrophe for us. But we aren't that person. And you can see how that person reacts, isn't it? You know, to criticism. Such a good example of what we're talking about. Yeah, such a good example. There's some criticism. First thing, it's unfair. The system's rigged. Yeah. Then, you built on that, I'm angry. Yeah? I'm angry and that person's bad and I'm going to criticize them back. Yeah, complete, you know, illustration of our own mind out in front of us, isn't it? And we look at the effects of that, and that's the same kind of effects as when we do it. Yeah, so, so good to learn, yeah, our teacher. Actually, it's a good way when you see people doing things that you don't like or that things you think are inappropriate, to say that's how I look when I do them. Because we usually have done them. That's why we're so good at seeing them in other people, because we know those trips very well. Okay, so let's come back to the Buddha's life. So there's the Buddha. He's trying to work with all these people who are like us. Yeah, wondering who in the world's going to understand. And then, you know, he goes and he talks to his 5 friends, and they see the wisdom in what he's saying. They become arhats. And so the Sangha begins in that way. Yeah, at the time of the Buddha, you know, we always have to see that Buddhism, every religion, exists within a culture. Nothing is culture-free. Nothing is, the actual Dharma, the realizations on the path, those transcend culture. Those never change over time. But all the other things, yeah, the robes, some of the way you keep the discipline and so on, those things are going to change because the culture is different, the economy is different, the politics are different, the climate is different. Yeah, so we have to be aware of how those things influence the development of Buddhism. And here I'm talking about the external aspects. Like I said, the basic principles and the path, those don't change. Okay, they can't change because our minds are basically like the minds of the people 2,600 years ago. It isn't that we have new mental factors that they didn't have. Yeah, or, you know, either on the positive side or the negative side. It's the same 84,000 afflictions. Yeah, it's just they come out in different ways in our society. Yeah, you know, people back then didn't get attached to their iPads. Yeah, they didn't wonder whether they, you know, they didn't think about whether their benefactors driving a BMW or a Lexus, you know. So the attachment didn't come out in the same way as our attachment does. But attachment is attachment. Okay, So those antidotes, and that whole part doesn't change. But the external part is going to be influenced by culture. And we see that, that Buddhism was in ancient India. It had a certain culture and a climate. At that time in India, there was much more talk about the governmental style was more these small republics, and they were moving to a more democratic way of living. But there was still what democracy meant then and what we think it is different. Yeah, because we think democracy means you have to vote over absolutely everything, and you should have an opinion and a say-so over absolutely everything. Okay, as proved by the retreat that went on in Canada that some of you were at, where the Americans wanted to vote over how much milk they had each day. You remember that? Yeah, and. Yeah, and the Singaporeans and the Mexicans at the retreat were going, what is going on here? Let's just have somebody make the decision and we'll live with it. But no, the Americans wanted to vote, how much milk are we going to allocate for each person per day? Yeah. So, each culture has its own things. So consensus is an important part in the Sangha. It's reflective of the values in India at that time, but it's only consensus of the people who are fully ordained. It's not consensus of everybody who's living there at the time. Okay, because everybody who lives there at the time is not necessarily a monastic. They don't know the monastic way of life. And if everybody has, an equal vote, then it could be a disaster. And this is, I know I'm getting off track here, but, bear with me. I keep doing it. I saw that when I lived at a monastery in France in the early 80s, is every nun who came there, no matter how long she was there, had an equal vote. So that meant every time a new person came, we had to vote about the schedule again, because nobody likes the schedule. Yeah, and that everything that happened, we had to constantly vote again and again and again. And then somebody might be really pushy and, okay, we'll do it your way. And then that person leaves. Yeah. So this is the reason why the Buddha said, it's the people who are fully ordained, who have been around for a while, who know the Vinaya, who have trained somewhat, who are the ones who make the decisions in the community, and their consensus is what is important. Yeah. Because otherwise everybody comes in and everybody wants their own way, and they don't know how to make a wise decision. So everybody's idea gets heard, but the consensus is by the fully ordained people. Okay? So that's somewhat related to the way that government was moving at the time of the Buddha. The Buddha also lived in a very hot climate. Yeah, he lived in a climate where there were many wandering mendicants, and their way of life was they had a bowl and they had a walking stick. They would walk into the village. Yeah, people would give them food, and that's how they sustained their lives. And so that was completely socially accepted in ancient India. Nothing wrong with that. When Buddhism went to China, they thought that the Sangha were beggars, and they looked down on people who were beggars, those, good-for-nothing people who can't get a job and are asking me for something. So they couldn't continue to go on Pindapat like that because it wasn't socially acceptable. when Buddhism went to Tibet, a quarter of the male population was ordained. Can you imagine if you had that many people every day going into the town, you know, and the lay people had to provide food for that many people? Yeah, it would be impossible. So they developed a different system of people taking offerings to the monastery. And then also some people donated, this happened in China and in Tibet, some people donated their fields to the monastery, and then the monastics, this is not such a good part, but you know, this is the way the social system was at the time. Then the people who were kind of like serfs, they were like peasants, they worked the land and then paid a tax to the monastery in terms of supplying food to the monastery or supplying money to the monastery. You know, this was one of the big things that happened in, you know, when communism came to that part of the world, is they were saying, you know, the monasteries are these big landowners, and they have all these poor peasants working for them, and the peasants don't own the land that they're working on. Yeah? And so, you know, this was something that came about historically, yeah, and then, you know, social ideas changed, and you had the communist takeover of some Buddhist countries, and things really had to change for the monasteries at that point. Okay? When Buddhism went to Southeast Asia, it was also very warm there, so it was fine to go on Pindapat, you know, to go on Pindapat, the alms round in Tibet. Sometimes it's freezing, so it wouldn't be so good. And actually, they did a lot of study in the monasteries, and they didn't want to spend half of their day walking into the town and walking back to get food. They found it easier to have the food there. Okay? The style of the robes changed as Buddhism went from one country to the next. Yeah? In ancient India, you know, you had the robes, and you'll see this with the Theravada monks now, where sometimes they don't wear a sleeve, and I look at them and it's like there's a half-naked man, will you please cover up? But you know, in their culture, that was socially acceptable. That was okay. The robes, most of the wandering mendicants wore some variety of saffron color because that was considered an ugly color. And but when Buddhism went to China, saffron or gold was only the emperor was allowed to wear that. So the monastics had to change the color of their robes, and in China, wearing gray was considered a more bland, ugly color, and so their robes became gray and black. You know, when Buddhism went to Tibet, they didn't, as I heard the story, they didn't have the color dyed to make this color. So, but they did have, you know, saffron can also be a maroon color. So, but they had dye to make it like that. So then the robes changed and they became like that. Okay, it's quite interesting, all these different things that happen. You know, kind of what's acceptable in one country and not acceptable in another. You would think in Tibet that the Sangha wearing sleeves and scarves and hats would be acceptable because it's so cold. Yeah, you're not supposed to wear sleeves or scarves or hats. Okay, but you could wear these big capes. That was okay. Don't ask me why. Okay, you could wear these big capes that were like a big blanket that you sat in and meditated. That was okay as long as your arm was uncovered underneath it. Okay? So, you know, each tradition adapted the Vinaya in different ways to its own culture, to its own way of thinking. And even within one country, you're going to have different ways of doing things. Yeah? And even among different monasteries in the same tradition, you're going to have different ways of doing things. So I really recommend having a very open, spacious mind. Otherwise, what we wind up doing is we're comparing, well, these people do it this way. I learned doing it this way. These people are wrong. Yeah. No, there's difference. Yeah. Difference does not mean right or wrong. And when you look at the reason why certain situations were adapted the way they were, they made sense in a particular culture and context. That doesn't mean that in bringing Buddhism to America, we cannot change those things. I think some of those things we need to change. Okay, for example, in ancient India, well, like I was saying before, the women, were the properties of their husbands, their fathers, then their husbands, then their sons. If you bring that kind of system into America, Buddhism is not going to spread. People are not going to put up with that. And I'm not just talking about the women not putting up with it. Many men tell me that, they don't like that kind of system. So that's going to have to change in Buddhism coming to America. Yeah. Of course, it's slow to change. And what's very interesting is when you see those same kind of sexist ideas in Western men who especially Western monks, it happens, who you would think would not have those kind of ideas. So, certain things have to change. They're slow in changing. Different groups do things different ways about this. And so, if you want to ordain, you also have to think of who is going to be your guiding teacher, what monastery you're going to stay in, and, how that's all going to work for you. Okay? Because there's these things that, people have differences on. Handling money is another one of them. Okay, within Theravada countries, some monastics handle money, some don't. Some people are very strict, won't even touch it. But of course, there's different ways that their monastery gets donations and uses money. Okay, so there's different ways to get that to happen. In Chinese Buddhism, Vietnamese, Tibetan, then people handle money. I think that has to do with, it may have to do somewhat with the bodhisattva practice and the idea that if you have resources as a bodhisattva, then you use that to be generous to others with. It may have some practical applications as well when if you have monastics living outside the city, as you did in China and Tibet, then maybe they needed to handle money when they had to go into town. It's quite interesting. I stayed at a Thai monastery for about 10 days, 2 weeks, a few years ago, and it was very interesting to see the number of lay people who go to that monasteries to help out. You don't see that in the Tibetan community, for example, because the lay people are busy earning their own living. In the Chinese community, you see some of the retired people, especially the older women, they'll go to the temple and help out. So unless you have a lot of lay people coming and going, and unless you have wealthy benefactors, then sometimes the Sangha, may need to handle money and do different things. Okay? So then the task is, well, how do you handle money in a way that is appropriate according to Vinaya, so that your mind doesn't start getting attached to it? Okay, so we have our own way of working that out here in the Abbey, according to our culture and everything like that, which I can tell you about later. But my main point here is that different people are going to do things different ways. Okay, we have these annual monastic gatherings. We've done it for 21 years now of Western Buddhist monastics, and so we share different things, and some people are really interested in doing Pindapat. So our Theravada friends, they do Pindapat, but of course they notify everybody beforehand, so all their students are in town ready to give them the food when they come. So it's not actual Pindapat where you're going and just stand. It's not begging, by the way. Translating it as begging is incorrect. Because begging, you're saying, give me, give me. Pindapat, alms round, you're not saying anything. You're not asking for anything. You just stand there. And if people give, fine. And if they don't give, you go to the next place. Okay? So they do the Pindapat, but they make sure that there's food there to receive. Okay? So, okay, it keeps the spirit, but it's not exactly what they used to do in ancient India. Yeah, our friends at Shasta Abbey wanted to do Pindapat, and in their town they had to go to the to town hall and get a parade permit, because there was going to be, a parade, a line of monastics following each other, walking down the street in town. So they had to get a parade permit. So we haven't tried it here in Newport yet. Someday we might, but kind of we devised a different system whereby, we don't ask for food. We let people know that we don't buy our own food, and then we eat only the food that people offer to us, okay? Which is why, many of you brought offerings, because that's the food we're all going to be eating. So, things are going to change according to the country and the climate and so on. And, we have to be kind of aware of that. Okay, any questions so far? Okay, so when the Buddha taught, like I was saying yesterday, he taught everyone, which is really quite admirable. Yeah, as you see what happened later, the Buddha taught everyone. They had some very rich benefactors, the different kings would support the Sangha, the different merchants would support the Sangha. But the Buddha made it so that the Sangha had its own internal laws, so to speak. The Vinaya is, some people see it as an ancient legal code. So that, because the Buddha did not want the Sangha to be under the authority of the government in the country. Because the government is run by lay people, and lay people making decisions on how the Sangha should operate doesn't work. Okay? But there's always been a dicey thing as Buddhism went from one country to the other, because in order to exist in some place, you had to have a good relationship with the king or the emperor or whoever it was in charge. Because if you didn't, so it was always quite difficult, and it worked out really different in different countries. In China, for example, it's one reason that the people who practice Chan or Zen, why they went to the mountains was to get out of the politics of the city. Yeah, because when you lived in the city, you had so many different political powers. You had the emperor, but you also had the Confucius hierarchy. Yeah, and then you had different warring groups in north and south and so on. And they didn't want to have any part of that. So they went and set up their monasteries out in the mountains. So that meant, of course, they couldn't go on Pindapat. Yeah, it meant that they had to grow some of their own food, even though part of the Vinaya rules are not to dig the earth and not to do agriculture. Because in ancient India, the Buddha didn't want the monastics to do that, because then they would become like lay people. And then their time would be used up in growing food and agriculture. and he didn't want that. But for the Chinese, they figure it's better to grow their own food than to be in the city and have to deal with all the politics of the court. Okay? So, you know, another example of how things change according to circumstances. Yeah, but at the Buddha's time, you know, they you know, had these big benefactors and so on, but they were able to manage it because they were a wandering group. You know, when you wander, you can't accumulate a lot of stuff. So you might have a big benefactor, but how much stuff can you carry with you? Yeah. And how luxurious is it going to be when you're walking from place to place? It's going to get dirty, isn't it? Okay, so maybe it wasn't so much of a problem there. But as time went on, the Sangha community became more cenobic. Is cenobic meaning wandering or settled? I forget which. But anyway, the Sangha became more settled, okay? At the beginning, like the other traditions, they wandered. But then what happened is, you know, in India nowadays, you have the monsoon season. And during monsoons, there's these torrential rains. It's also the time when the crops are growing. Yeah. And so there was the Sangha trying to walk, to go on Pindapat in the torrential rains, getting completely, you know, drenched, and walking across people's rice paddies, and the lay people complained. You know, these people are walking across our rice paddies and destroying our crops. And so therefore the Buddhists set up this thing called Varsa, or the rains retreat, where the Sangha stays in one place for 3 months. Yeah, and so then you had the kings and the merchants offering land, offering food to the Sangha during the Varsa, and they would stay in one place for those 3 months. Yeah. Then there was a Vinaya precept that came up that said after the Varsa you had to leave, you know, because the Buddha didn't want everybody just staying on afterwards, because then you get attached to the place, you start accumulating stuff. Okay, but as life happens, you know, after the Buddha's death, then the Sangha started becoming more and more stationary and not moving around. And as Buddhism spread to different cultures, the climate was different. It's too cold to you know, wander all the time and not have a stable roof over your head. You know, it's not healthy. You can't practice. And so you started having people who would not leave after the Varsa, after the rains retreat. They would stay put. And so slowly over the centuries, you got the establishment of monasteries. Okay, and so that of course changed things, because once the Sangha has buildings, then you have to finance the buildings, you have to upkeep the buildings, and so on and so forth. So that's going to change the economic structure by which the Sangha lives, and that's going to change the way in which people keep the precepts. Okay, and so, like I said, different climates, different ways of living as a monastic, so you're going to have different things. I went to one monastery in Malaysia when I was there. They did not have a kitchen at their monastery, and they lived up in the hills. They walked down every day for lunch, and their supporters had arranged to meet them in one place every day, and the supporters would take turns cooking and would give them the food. They would walk back up and eat it. So they didn't have a kitchen at their place at all. And every day, you know, you walk down and you got your food and come back up. In Tibet, clearly that would be impossible. The monasteries were too far away, too many monastics, too cold. Yeah, so they had a whole other system for doing that. Yeah. Yeah, but then, you know, here it's quite interesting, you know, bringing Buddhism to the West, because in Asia, in general, I would say things are changing now, but in general, previously, lay people would only visit the monastery for the day, make offerings, and leave. Okay? Nowadays, as you notice, you know, we have accommodation for lay people to stay. And many monasteries now in China, I don't know China proper, but Taiwan also, there are accommodations for some lay people, and monasteries host the retreats, and the lay people come for the retreats and everything like that. And so that's a different, that's a big change. And so then you need, you know, a different economic system, because if you're going to start building rooms not only for the monastics, but for the lay people to have retreats in a bigger meditation hall, then you need more funds, then da-da-da-da-da, okay? So, and here, bringing Buddhism to America, it's going to be different yet, because we're influenced by Christian monasteries, and people come here with expectations that in some ways we're going to be like Christian monasteries. And so in some ways we have to adopt to their model, in some ways we have to say, no, we're not doing things like that. But Christian monasteries now have facilities for lay people and retreat facilities for lay people and so on. Okay? So we try and do that too. Yeah, you know, most of our Theravada friends in America, they don't have, you know, accommodation for lay people. Some do, but most of the ones that I know don't. Okay, so there's different decisions made when you're bringing Buddhism to a new country and setting things up in a different way. Okay, so everybody's going to kind of think through it differently and so on. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Do you have to, the precepts that you can't keep literally, like the one, the vasa, where you have to eat, handling of money, does monastic have to confess?
Yeah. What we try and do here is we have, as you know, rules about how money can be used and for what it can be used. And we always say on our posada, like yesterday, if we've received personal offerings, we declare it. We declare what we do with it. You know, if we have to handle money to buy a ticket or a book or something like that, we say it on the posada day. Yeah, we don't consider it you know, a horrible offense, but in keeping with the precepts and to have full disclosure, then we mention all these things.
So like the one about the vasa, after the vasa, you know, people not staying together?
Yeah, well, actually, what the way it is now is you have to leave that day and go out, okay? But it's interesting because there's also the katina ceremony, and at least in the Chinese tradition or in Tibetan tradition, when you do the katina, one person has to stay in the monastery during the whole katina time. Katina is after the end of the varsa. Please look here, not out the window. After the varsa is over, because in ancient India it was very hard for people to get robes, and so there came to be the custom of people bringing cloth to the monastery after the varsa, because their robes were usually ruined then after the rain and so on. So the katina is that ceremony for doing that. But the way the way you're supposed to do it is one person who has the katina robe can't leave the monastery for that period of time, but everybody else can go in and out. But at least on the day that you have the pravarana, the end, then everybody should go outside the territory and then come back in, you know? So, yeah, so we do like that, but we're still living here, we're not wandering, okay? I mean, if we tried to wander in the US, we would get arrested. And actually, with the number of guns in this country, we might get killed before we got arrested. Yeah? So I don't think wandering is so wise here. Okay. Okay. So the Sangha, you know, had to adapt to different situations, different cultures, especially as it started to spread from one place to the other. Yeah. And like I mentioned yesterday, all the precepts grew up because of specific actions that people did. In the Tibetan tradition, Chinese too, I'm not sure about Theravada, but they speak of the 6 naughty monks and 6 naughty nuns. And they say we have to be grateful to them because due to their kindness we have our precepts. But they were naughty and they did things that either other Sangha members complained about or the lay people said, you know, this is not very inspiring for, you know, a spiritual practitioner. And so the precepts grew up because of that. Yeah. And right now we have 3 extant systems of Vinaya, because the thing is, you know, Buddha just taught the Dharma. He taught the Vinaya. Yeah. He didn't teach Theravada Vinaya or Dharmaguptaka Vinaya or Mula Sravastivada Vinaya. He just taught Vinaya. But as Buddhism spread to different places, because it was an oral tradition, you didn't have mass communications or mass transportation, then, you know, things got passed down and there were slight changes that came in. So, yeah, it's actually quite interesting how this is. You know, the Buddha just taught, and he taught about harmony, and he taught about cooperation. And now we have all these different traditions who say, our way is the best way of doing it, you know, which I really consider rather foolish. It's better just to say there's different ways, not best way. But they all talk about after the Buddha passed away, and the Sangha started taking the Dharma in all 10 directions, and people began to ordain and so on. Then you have the evolution of what they call 18 traditions, 18 schools, the early Buddhism's 18 schools. Now what's very interesting is there are several different variations of what those 18 schools are. Nobody even agrees on what the 18 are. And within the 18 you have major divisions, you know, with, you know, this is the major one and it has sub-schools. But people don't even agree necessarily about that either, okay? But everybody says there were 18. So what happened is, because Buddhism went in different directions, and it's an oral tradition, certain things, you know, became emphasized, and certain things became de-emphasized according to the environment that people were in, okay? And so from those original 18, we have 3 extant Vinaya systems. So one is the Pali, which now has you know, the Theravada, and that's in Sri Lanka, Thailand, a little bit in Vietnam, somewhat in Malaysia, Singapore, a little bit in Indonesia, you know, Burma, Laos, Cambodia, all of those, you know, was where the Theravada system is. Then you have the Dharmaguptaka Vinaya, that's the one followed in China, Taiwan, Korea. Japan had monastics for a while, but then in the Meiji Restoration in the middle of the 19th century, the government made all the monastics disrobe. Yeah, good example of government interference with the monastics and what happened. Okay, then you have the Mula Sravastivada Vinaya, which is popular in the Himalaya region, Tibet, Mongolia. Okay, so considering that it was an oral tradition passed down for many centuries, the Vinayas are actually remarkably similar. You know, there aren't huge, enormous differences between them. Of course, if you're a Vinaya scholar, you're going to see many differences. Yeah, but the basic ways of operating, the basic ideas behind the Vinaya are very, very similar. Okay, at our monastic gathering, for example, one year we had a fashion show, and where everybody showed their robes to, you know, everybody else. Yeah. And what was so interesting is we saw that every tradition, in one way or another, had the pattern of patches, and a very similar pattern of patches, where your central panel is, which ones overlay on the other ones. Yeah. In Japan, we have the Japanese monastics that come from Shasta Abbey are celibate, so that, you know, they come to the monastic conference. So they wear the what do you call it, the rakushu? Yeah, rakushu. Yeah, but the pattern is the same as like on this. Yeah. In the Chinese tradition, you have the 5-stripe, 7-stripe, 9-stripe. That corresponds to the Tibetan, you know, our shemdap, our lower skirt, our chugu, and then our namjar. Yeah, except the Tibetans have often up to 23 panels instead of the 9 panels in their namjar. The 9 panels make it so much easier to wear. The 23 panels, you know, it takes a long time to sew, and it makes it, yeah, much bulkier. Anyway, but it was amazing, you know, that is the same in all the traditions. It survived, yeah. And, you know, the celibacy as, you know, the 4 main, what we call the 4 root precepts, those are the same across the board, okay? Then, you know, there's the different classes of precepts, so there's some variety in those, but not huge differences, okay? Which is really rather remarkable, you know, and I think that's why we really need to respect all the traditions and what's happening. Okay, when the Buddha passed away, yeah, then there was a crisis of leadership, because until that time, whenever there was some question about how to keep the Vinaya and the different precepts, or about the Dharma and how to practice, the Buddha was the authority. Yeah, when the Buddha passed away, there wasn't the common authority that everybody respected. Okay, so you have the story that after the Buddha passed away, there was one old monk who said, "Oh, thank God, it's gone now. We don't have to follow all those ridiculous rules." So, yeah, so some of the Sangha grew quite alarmed at that, particularly Mahakassapa, who was one of the foremost monks, in discipline. Yeah, he was a very ascetic monk. So he called a council, you know, and he thought, we really have to recite all of the teachings now and systematize them, codify them, so that we don't have people like this monk saying, let's just throw this out and throw that out. Okay, so they had the first council. It was interesting when you read the first council and you read some people's interpretation of it. It seems like they all agreed on one level, but there were undercurrents where they didn't all agree. You had different factions. You had Mahakassapa's faction, very ascetic, very strict, taking the precepts very literal. You had Ananda, who was the Buddha's attendant for most of his lifetime. Ananda, who's very loving, very jovial, really, like that. His name is in Tibetan, well, Ananda means happy, okay? Yeah. So he had that kind of personality. So you had these two leaders with very different personalities who are going to have different emphases, yeah? So as the story goes, they decided on something. But even the story, you can't get everybody agreeing even on that, because you have the three baskets, the Vinaya, the Sutra, the Abhidharma. Okay, so everybody accepts the Vinaya, the monastic discipline. They recited at the first council. Everybody accepts the sutras were recited. At least some of the sutras were recited according to the Sanskrit tradition. There were more sutras that were not recited at the first council that later became more widespread in India. They became what is called the Mahayana sutras, but they say the Buddha taught them. They just weren't widespread. They weren't recited at that council. Okay. But then the Abhidharma. Yeah. Now, there's different versions, there's different attitudes towards the Abhidharma. Some people say, okay, even in Thailand, I talk to my friends, some people say that the Abhidharma, which is, it's the teachings, but it's very technical. Oh my goodness. Divisions into two, divisions into three, how this division correlates with that, and the subdivisions of this, and how this group and that group relate, and it's very detailed, very analytical. So some people say that the Buddha taught that to his mother, who had, she had died after he was born, but she was reborn in one of the God realms. So they say that during the Varsa, the rainy seasons retreat, the Buddha, one Varsa, he would go there and he taught his mother the Abhidharma. And that's how the Abhidharma teachings came about, because he taught them to his mother, and then he came down to earth and met with Shariputra each evening and told Shariputra what he had taught his mother, and Shariputra wrote that down, and that became the Abhidharma. Okay? So some people say that. Other people say the Abhidharma was written later by different arhats. Okay? So even the Abhidharma, which is one of the three baskets of teachings, did the Buddha say it himself, or did the arhat say it? When exactly did it come about? During the Buddha's life or after the Buddha's life? Okay? So anyway, you had these 18 traditions. They all had Vinaya, Sutra, Abhidharma. Yeah? And then, of course, some traditions lasted longer than others. There may have been a drought in a certain area, or there may have been political unrest and warfare. But, many of those traditions either died out or they merged with other traditions. Yeah. And it seems, too, that maybe some new traditions came in, and that's why there were more than the 18. So there's a lot of historical discussion about this. Yeah, the Tibetans have their version of the history, the Sri Lankans have their version, the Chinese have their version, and then the academic scholars have their version too. So which one is right? I have no idea. But I think, I studied history and liberal arts in college, so I'm quite interested in this thing about how things develop over time, how different factors in society affect each other and affect the way people think. Okay, so that's just a little bit more about the development over time. Yeah.
When it comes to the difference of the three extant traditions right now, does that also include the other two baskets besides the Vinaya, that they have also slightly differences in the sutras and the Abhidharma as well?
Oh, yeah. No, there's differences. The Vinayas, I would say, in some way are the most similar. Yeah, but you have within the Pali canon, the Nikayas, 5 Nikayas. 4 of those Nikayas are found, Nikayas are like groups, large groups of sutras. You have 4 of those Nikayas in the Chinese canon. Yeah, and the sutras in many ways are quite similar, the sutras that are in there. You have in some areas different translations. I have a friend who's working on comparing the Pali version of certain sutras to the Chinese version of certain sutras. Okay, so you have that, but then within the Chinese canon and the Tibetan canon, because when we talk about canons, we have 3 major traditions now: the Pali canon, the Chinese canon, the Tibetan canon. So the Tibetan and Chinese canon share a lot of sutras, all the Mahayana sutras, that are not found in the Pali canon, but are shared in the 2 Mahayana canons. Okay, in terms of Vinaya, in terms of Abhidharma, the Tibetans mostly have just Vasubandhu. There's in the Pali Vinaya, there's a set. Not Vinaya, in the Pali canon, there's a set of 7 Abhidharma scriptures. The Chinese also have a set of 7 Abhidharma scriptures, but the 7 in both these traditions are completely different. Okay, but they all have the set, the 7 sets. Okay, the Tibetan only have one of the 7 that is shared in common with the Chinese. And then they have Vasubandhu, and then they have little sprinklings of Abhidharma stuff here and there in their canon. It's quite interesting. Then the tantric teachings, that you have a lot in Tibet, because Buddhism went to Tibet later, so Tantra was very popular in India at that time. So that's quite prominent in the Kangyur and Tengyur. You have some of that in China, but not as much, because Buddhism went to China earlier. And you don't have that in the Theravada canon. Tantra went there, but then, the king kind of shut down 2 monasteries who were more inclined towards Mahayana and Tantra, and so that all kind of died out there. Okay. So within the canon, the 3 canons, you have a lot of shared material, but you also have a lot of unique material. And even within the Tibetan, if you have the Nyingma version of the canon, and because the Nyingma is the early, the old translation school, and the other 3 Tibetan traditions are the new translation schools. So the old translation school, they have different tantras and some different texts that the new translation doesn't have, and vice versa when it comes to tantras. Mm-hmm.
Well, in the Vinaya basket, what's included there other than the monastic vows and inscriptions?
There's 20 skandakas in the Vinaya. Let me tell you what they consist of. There's different ways. If you look in Buddhism, One Teacher, Many Traditions, it has a more complete explanation. But let me tell you what the skandakas are. Where are they? Okay. So the Chinese have 20. I think that the Theravada has 17 Skandakas. Okay, so the ordination procedure, the recitation of the Pratimoksha Sutra. Third is rains retreat. Fourth is the pravarana, the confession ceremony at the ends of the rain retreat. Fifth is the usage of things made from hides, like, car seats. Yeah, leather couches, leather car seats, and shoes, yeah. 6 is making and wearing robes. 7 is usage and retention of medicine. 8, the receiving and giving away of the robe of merit. That's the katina that I spoke of. 9 is living in harmony and proceedings in case of dissension. 10 is the all the sangha karmas, the sangha proceedings to make decisions. 11 is the handling of quarrelsome monastics. Who wants to sign up for that? 12 is the purification of the Sangha-Vasesha transgressions. Sangha-Vasesha is it's the second most serious category of the second most serious precepts. 13 is consequences for concealing the commitments of Sangha-Vasesha, for concealing your offenses. 14 is handling of those who have committed transgressions and are not allowed to attend posada, because unless you have made amends, you are not counted as part of the quorum for reciting the Pratimoksha Sutra. 15 is handling cases of ruining the harmony of the Sangha. 16, procedures for ending disputes. 17, matters relating to Bhikshuni ordination and recitation of the Bhikshuni Pratimoksha Sutra. 18, manners, etiquette for different situations. 19, usage of housing, beds, and clothing. And 20, extensive explanations on all the skandhas. Okay? And so that's also contained. So what you have is the Buddha taught things not to do, and he taught things to do. So the Pratimoksha Sutra is mostly the proscribed things, what the Sangha's not supposed to do. In the Skandakas, there's many of the prescribed things, the things that the Sangha's supposed to do. Okay, yeah?
Hearing this kind of account, it's very inspiring to also think, for me, like the translators, because it's like the languages are like different, and like how Jackie talks, is how the thought process of the translator.
Yeah.
Must have been a tremendous job.
I think, yeah. I mean, we owe a tremendous debt to the translators. Translators are often overlooked because they're seen as the mouthpiece of the person who's teaching. But we really owe them a great debt, because otherwise we wouldn't have the scriptures and we wouldn't have oral teachings. Yeah. And it wasn't easy. The Tibetans had a system which worked very well. They had one person who was a native Tibetan speaker, one person who was a native Sanskrit speaker. And they would work together on all the translations. So that worked very well, because then you had people who knew both, who knew both languages, but one was their native language, so they knew it better and could suss out the nuances.